Okay, we're going to go with a quick history of the United States here. The United States, for our purposes, the history will begin with the founding of the colony of Roanoke in the year 1585. After Roanoke, the next colony that's founded is Jamestown. It's the first permanent settlement, founded in 1607. Shortly after that, 13 years later, a colony of Plymouth is founded by the Pilgrims. And then following Plymouth, it takes just another 3 years before we have a colony of New Hampshire. A bunch of guys who were looking to fish founded a colony up the coast just from Plymouth a little bit. Then New Amsterdam, founded by the Dutch, which will later become New York in 1625. Massachusetts Bay Colony, the largest colony at that point, is founded in 1630. The colonies are coming fast and furious by this point. Maryland, 2 years later in 1632. And then Connecticut and Providence in the same year in 1636, Providence eventually becoming Rhode Island. The colony of Delaware then is founded in 1638. And then a gap of almost 30 years, and we have the two colonies then founded, North and South Carolina in 1663. In 1664, a year later, we have the colony of New Jersey. At this point, the Dutch are kicked out by the English, and the colony of New Amsterdam is split into two, one being New York, the colony or the state that we have today, and New Jersey. Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers, by William Penn in 1681, again for religious purposes, and the last of the 13 colonies in 1732 was Georgia. The next significant event in the story of the United States is really the French and Indian War in 1754, goes to 1763, and really sets the stage for what will become the American Revolution in 1775 and 1780 to 1781, a 6-year conflict. In the middle of that, on July 4th, 1776, we sign our Declaration of Independence, and that's what we still observe today as our Independence Day. A few years later, in 1788, we have the ratification of the United States Constitution, and this is the birth of the government that we have to this day. The first significant challenge to the young country was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. 9 years later, we double the size of our country under President Thomas Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and then we fight what becomes known as our second war for independence in some quarters, the War of 1812, again against Great Britain, and are successful in that war as well. A few short years later, 6 years later, a hero of that war, Andrew Jackson, takes over Florida, from Spain in 1818. And then slavery becomes a big issue, and we come up with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. In 1830, 10 years later, now by this time Andrew Jackson being President of the United States, we have the Trail of Tears, where Indian tribes such as the Cherokee are sent from the southeast of the United States into the territory of Oklahoma. In 1846, we fight the Mexican-American War. In 1849, we have the California Gold Rush, a territory that we had gained as a result of the Mexican-American War. By 1854, slavery was again becoming an issue, and we passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which in effect nullifies the Compromise of 1820 as well as the Great Compromise of 1850, and that leads us into, really, the Civil War. The first state to secede is South Carolina, secedes in 1860, and the Civil War lasts from about 1860 to 1865. Shortly after the Civil War, we have the purchase of Alaska, also known as Seward's Folly, in 1867. And now the United States is really starting to look like the United States. And we connect our country from one end to the other with the first transcontinental railroad around 1869 to Promontory Point, Utah. As we go ahead and cross the country, we begin to have conflict with the western tribes, the Native Americans. In 1876, we have Custer's last stand, General George Armstrong Custer, who's defeated by the Native Americans he faces. And then in 1890, we have the Battle of Wounded Knee, which in effect ends the conflict with the Native Americans, at least as a military conflict. The Spanish-American War in 1898 then really claims a global empire for the Americans. We get places like the Philippines and Puerto Rico. We go ahead then to cement our status as a world power. We build the Panama Canal, which allows our fleet to move from one side of the country to the other, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and quickly, and allows commerce to pass quickly without having to go all the way around South America. In 1917, we have World War I, which again establishes the United States as a global power. The time period following that is a time of tremendous prosperity, the 1920s, but that comes to an end with the stock market crash of 1929, signaling the beginning of the Great Depression. In 1932, we elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt as our president, and he establishes the New Deal, which fundamentally alters the relationship between the government and its people. 1941 marks the beginning of World War II, when the Japanese attack us on December 7, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, and that conflict ends in 1945 when we drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And that goes ahead and leads us almost directly into the Cold War. The Berlin airlift of 1948 is one of the earliest events of the Cold War. A year later, we go ahead and we become a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1950, you have the Korean War, another Cold War conflict. The Cold War also sees the Second Red Scare, McCarthy hearings of 1954, the first major television event. Also in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education. The civil rights movement is coming into its own during the 1950s. The Cuban Missile Crisis, another Cold War event, probably the closest this country has ever come to nuclear war. And then the Tonkin Gulf Resolution of 1964, which really ramps up our involvement in a little-known conflict called Vietnam. In 1968, again, the civil rights movement has been in full swing. Martin Luther King, one of the leaders of that movement, is assassinated in 1968. In 1973, we go ahead and withdraw under Richard Nixon from Vietnam. In 1979, we begin to see the Middle East starting to heat up. The Iranian hostage crisis takes place in 1979 under Jimmy Carter. And in 1980, in part because of the crisis, Ronald Reagan defeats Carter and really moves the country away from that New Deal mindset for the first time in almost 50 years. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989, symbolizing the end of the Cold War. A few years later, the Soviet Union itself will fall. Operation Desert Storm, then, in 1991 takes place, and we invade Iraq. And really, this kind of becomes the beginning of a shift from the Cold War into a new mindset, where we focus much more on the Middle East. The contract with America in 1994 was the result of the Republicans taking the House for the first time in 40 years, and again, continuing that shift from the New Deal mindset into a more conservative mindset. Clinton then, who was president during the time, was impeached in 1998, a big scandal for the day. And then September 11th, 2001, again, the beginning of really the War on Terror, almost taking the place of the Cold War. The invasion of Iraq for the second time now in 2003, again under President Bush, but this time a different President Bush, and then the election of President Obama in 2008. That's it in a nutshell. Thanks a lot.